Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
And thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi, and in today's episode, we're going to be diving into the NFL Combine, which just wrapped up this past weekend, and all eyes were on Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis to see what college players were going to put up their best efforts and try to increase their draft stock the most going into next month's NFL draft. And so far, leading up to the Combine, we've been hearing a lot about the same players that we've been seeing headlines for the entire season. And it just their coverage seems to have increased since the season has ended, especially regarding LSU quarterback Joe Burrow, reigning Heisman Trophy winner. Obviously, the attention is deserved, and a lot of criticism has been made about his hand size, and NFL scouts love to look at things like height and weight, and that's what the Combine is for. It was perfect for that. So even though we didn't see Joe Burrow at this year's Combine, or Alabama quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, who we've also been hearing a lot about, we did get to see Clemson's linebacker Isaiah Simmons, who basically beasted all over and impressed scouts all over the field, which shouldn't be a surprise if you watched him play defense at Clemson. Even if you asked him himself, he's given the answer to what his position is by just saying defense. And he definitely proved it by putting up not one of the fastest linebacker time of the Combine with a 4.39 40-yard dash, which wasn't just fast for linebackers. It was also on par with the fastest running back time with Wisconsin's Jonathan Taylor, which, if you know Jonathan Taylor's record at Wisconsin and the fact that he was even in the Heisman discussion himself, though only a year ago, it's not a mystery as to why this seems so impressive. And he didn't only impress at the 40, he also had a 39-inch vertical, which came out as fourth best amongst his group, and jumped 11 feet in the broad jump, which was the second best performance. So Isaiah Simmons has definitely proven that defense can indeed be positional, and as long as you have the talent and the versatility, you can really be placed anywhere on the field, which he did for Clemson. He lined up on the line as a pass rusher, but he was also dropped back into the secondary and played cornerback and some safety. So he really showed that he can be placed anywhere. And it's interesting because positionless football hasn't always been seen as the most advantageous kind of way to play. And nowadays there's a lot more flexibility when it comes to what coaches will use and how they want to use players. So what was once seen as a disadvantage is probably going to be looked at as advantageous for Simmons, who coming in at 6'3" and 238 pounds, that's not a small guy, but the fact that you know that you can put him anywhere and he can play flexibly definitely adds another dynamic to a defense, and it added another dynamic to Clemson's defense because he was a big part of, trying to defend that national championship and ultimately being able to overcome Ohio State in that semifinal game came down to a lot of Clemson's defensive efforts, and a lot of the season in general for Clemson came down to the defensive efforts to kind of hold up the offensive side and kind of maintain the standard that they had gotten used to. Although they were very good, a lot of people would say that they kind of underachieved, or not necessarily underachieved, but kind of just didn't elevate as much as they would have expected from an experienced team like Clemson that has now been in the college football playoff 3 times. So to be able to anchor a defense like that and be able to stand out on a defense like that really held up a defending championship team is not anything to turn your back on. And the fact that Isaiah Simmons is already now being compared to the height of Seattle wide receiver DK Metcalf, or the speed of former Chicago Bear Devin Hester, or the hops of Atlanta Falcon Julio Jones, which is impressive in itself, or the explosiveness of Saints running back Alvin Kamara, and the sturdiness of linebacker Roquan Smith. So to be able to come out of college and be so young and already holding your own is quite impressive. So with the credentials and the background that Isaiah Simmons has, I wouldn't be surprised to see him go within the top 5, probably to a team like the New York Giants that are struggling on their defense and need that kind of plug and play, ready to go, start right away and make an immediate impact kind of player. And based off of the combine results from this weekend, Isaiah Simmons definitely looks like he has that ability. Simmons wasn't the only player impressive of the weekend. So let's take a look at the offense, starting with Alabama's Henry Ruggs III, who ran away with this entire thing, literally, with the fastest 40 time of the day, easily, and the second fastest of all time, coming in at 4.27, which is only behind John Ross's 2017 time of 4.22, which was seemingly untouchable. For years, nobody thought anybody would be able to approach 4.22. So for Ruggs to come in and display such speed, it is pretty impressive, but it also isn't surprising because that's the kind of brand that Alabama kind of tried to build their dynasty on, especially in recent years. They've had a lot of quick, small, fast playmaking receivers, Ruggs being one of them. We also saw his counterpart, Jerry Jeudy, at the Combine. But Ruggs managed to prove that he's not just fast, adding in a 42-inch vertical jump. But wide receivers weren't the only playmakers, because there were 2 300-pound players. It's both offensive linemen. One was Iowa's Tristan Wirfs, the other Louisville's Mekhi Becton. Both ran the 40-yard dash in 5.1 seconds or less. And Wirfs himself broke not 1, but 2 offensive line combine records. First was a 10-foot jump in the broad jump, and the other was a 36.5-inch vertical jump. So those offensive linemen are proving that they can move. And flexibility, versatility, speed, agility, they've all come out this weekend at the Combine as being the kind of traits that scouts and NFL teams are looking for. And a lot of those traits are being paid attention to a lot more by the NFL scouts because they've seen those kind of things work out in college. So it seems like the game is starting to innovate a little bit, and college is kind of taking the lead on that. And speaking of innovating, there are 2 more linemen that made history, but this time they're on the defense side. Nebraska's Khalil Davis and Oklahoma's Neville Gallimore both made history by becoming the only 300-plus pound linemen to run their 40-yard dash in less than 4.8 seconds, going back to 2006. And it may just all sound like a lot of stats, but especially coming from linemen that are expected to be built heavier and in the past haven't always been expected to be able to move with agility. Seeing performances like this out of the Combine is really promising for the future of football, and it just shows that as the game continues to innovate, the players are the ones who are showing that they are leading the way on that innovation from within. And there's no better proof of that from the Combine than the 2 defensive linemen who made history as well. One was Nebraska's Khalil Davis, the other Oklahoma's Neville Gallimore, who both became the only 300-pound linemen to run a sub 4.8 second 40-yard dash since 2006. That just goes to show that every position is evolving. The defensive linemen also have to be able to be flexible and to be agile and to be able to get to the quarterback now more than ever, especially since the quarterback position has been changing in football as well. But even within this, if you look at it a little closer, a little more attention has to go to Khalil Davis out of Nebraska, because just like Simmons, his stats at the Combine were able to prove that he was versatile on the field and prove that versatility is something that teams in the NFL are looking for and something that football is going to be turning to in the future. And Davis, his 40 time clocked in at 4.75. That's also a running back caliber, which is unheard of from a defensive lineman. And He racked up the second most reps on the bench press at 32. So not only did he show off that he had strength, which is typically expected from defensive linemen, of course, they're expected to be strong and hold their ground, but he also showed that he can combine that with speed and still run at the same rate as a running back, but still maintain that build and that strength that's essential to the position that he plays. Now, the Combine can also be a really fun time to try and see what kind of stars are going to have a breakout season once they enter the NFL that maybe didn't get a chance to shine to their full potential while they were in college. One of those players that we could possibly be seeing is Donovan Peoples-Jones out of Michigan, who was one of the Combine's biggest wide receiver stars this year. He is very set up for a breakout rookie season, mostly because when he was at Michigan, we didn't really see him get a lot of accurate targets, and Michigan's offense really wasn't clicking as much last season as it has in years past. But luckily, the former 5-star recruit helped his draft stock and probably rose up the draft boards with a strong all-around performance at this year's Combine, but he especially stood out when it came to jumping. Peoples-Jones was the weekend's leader in broad jump and vertical leap. He jumped for a combined 183.5 inches over the weekend, which is just incredible. And his broad jump alone was 11 feet and 7 inches. And his vertical was basically him jumping out of the building at 44.5 inches. That makes Peoples-Jones tied for third all time in the vertical jump, trailing just Chris Conley and Donald Washington, who only beat him by half an inch. DJP is only 6'2" and 212 pounds, but he obviously shows that he has springs in his legs. And as a wide receiver in this modern game, especially in the NFL, that's going to be seen as an asset to a lot of teams. And he's been criticized in his college game for not being seen as dynamic, but based off of the Combine results, it looks like we're going to see a different side of his skill set. Now, the Combine is taken seriously, but it's not always fun and games, especially when it comes to certain positions that don't always get a chance to shine. Like the position of punter, and more specifically Arizona State's punter, Michael Turk, who stole the show from a bunch of offensive linemen on the bench press by doing 25 reps, which ended up being more than 19 offensive linemen and 21 defensive linemen this year. It's always good to see special teams get a chance to shine in this kind of showcase. All in all, there was a lot of talent that was put on display at the Combine. It's a great tool to be able to evaluate Division I players on an equal plane, and we were able to see them comparably side by side within their group without factoring in anything that is usually talked about in college sports, such as conference or strength of schedule or opponents, or even factoring in injury for the most part. So we were able to take a look at some prospects that may have blown away the scouts this year and put their name on, added their name to a few draft boards, probably around the league. So we're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, we're going to dive into the teams that are going to be hit the hardest by players that are leaving for the NFL.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. And before the break, we broke down the standout players from the Combine. Some of them we touched on Isaiah Simmons. We touched on Henry Ruggs III. We talked about a couple offensive linemen in Tristan Wirfs and Mekhi Becton. And we covered a few defensive linemen in Khalil Davis and Neville Gallimore. But now we're going to talk about the teams that they left. Now that the combine has wrapped up from the weekend, which teams have their work cut out for them in trying to rebuild? Let's start with LSU, which might be surprising to some, but it shouldn't come as a shock that the biggest programs coming out of the Power 5 conferences usually lose the most players to the NFL. They probably have the best players coming out of high school who are aiming to make the NFL. That's their final goal. But maybe coming off of a national championship, people might not be expecting a team like LSU to struggle in continuing on their dynasty, or maybe rebounding after losing a quarterback like we mentioned before in Joe Burrow. But surprisingly, they are losing a lot of their playmaking talent. And obviously their starting quarterback and tight end Thaddeus Moss, who was a really big piece of their offense in the college football playoff last year, especially in the national championship game where he caught multiple touchdowns, and was a key part in that win. So having to replace even those two playmakers alone is going to be big shoes to fill for LSU. But it'd be bad enough if it stopped there, but they're also losing their running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Wide receiver Justin Jefferson is also entering the draft. Their safety Grant Delpit also isn't returning to college, so they still have a huge shoes to fill. And a lot of those players that they recruited are going to be expected to make immediate impacts and be able to plug into the starting lineup right away and be able to play at full capacity, which we don't always see in college when it comes to freshmen coming right out of high school. Usually we'll see freshmen redshirt and sit out their first season instead of, being essentially thrown right into the fire. But when it comes to LSU, they're going to be expecting immediate impacts from recruits such as Eric Gilbert, who is a tight end. He's going to be expected to come in and kind of fill the spot left by Thaddeus Moss right away. And they think that they have a few pieces that are like tight end Eric Gilbert to come in and help bolster their offense, but that has a lot of pressure to be put on the shoulders of 18 and 19-year-old kids. If there's any coach possibly in college football that could be able to pull a team together with such circumstances, it's probably going to be Coach Ed Orgeron out of LSU has kind of proven that he's the kind of coach that knows how to persevere and how to also use the pieces that he has to the best of their ability and kind of bring them out to be the best player that they can be and fit into the system that he's designed. And he kind of designs his team in that way. If you look at how he developed Joe Burrow last season, he took a transfer from Ohio State, who was at one point a third-string quarterback, and gave him the reins on his own talent and gave him the ability to hear what Joe needed in order to be a competent and quarterback and excel at the position. And we were able to see the results of that. So if Coach O is continuing that approach with the new recruits that are coming in, especially players that are 4-star recruits for the most part, they have more 4-star recruits than any other team in the country. I think they'll be able to unlock something that they don't even know that they currently have, and they can possibly continue on the dynastic path that they're on. Who knows? Maybe we'll even be talking about LSU in the future the way we talked about Alabama for years. Speaking of Alabama, they also have big quarterback shoes to fill since their star Tua Tagovailoa is entering the draft. Obviously, he didn't end the season in the best way, going down with a hip injury. At a point where they didn't really have a chance at the playoff for the first time since the playoffs began in 2014. But their only hole isn't even just at quarterback, because, like mentioned before, they're losing Henry Ruggs III and his counterpart at wide receiver Jerry Jeudy. And they're also taking some hits on the defensive side of the ball with linebacker Terrell Lewis and safety Xavier McKinney also entering the draft. So Alabama's going to have some work cut out for them after a season that's definitely described as a down season, and for them, they would probably say an unsuccessful season, finishing at their worst positioning in the college football playoff ranking since it even began. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of moves that Alabama is going to make, and the keys that Nick Saban is going to be looking for in order to get his team back to the level that they've been playing at for years now. But those aren't the only SEC teams that are going to be taking a hit with this year's draft, because Georgia is also losing a lot. especially on offense. They're going to have to recover from losing quarterback Jake Fromm and running back DeAndre Swift. And on the offensive line, tackles Andrew Thomas and Isaiah Wilson and guard Solomon Kinley. So with LSU, Alabama, and Georgia being three of the teams that were hit the hardest, it's going to be really interesting to look at next season because those three teams are all within the SEC conference, and they've all been huge competitors within the SEC conference and are likely going to be battling for the same college football playoff spots come next postseason. So a lot of what's going to happen then is going to start now in the off season, between now and August when the season starts. A lot of practices and spring games obviously still need to happen between now and then. But if you keep an eye on how those things are progressing, it'll really show the direction that this season is going to take going forward, especially when it comes to the SEC, which everyone always has their eyes on all year long anyway. But in this case, we can see a lot of different extremes when it comes to the SEC. We can see some teams that we've always known to be at the top fall off and maybe slide down a little bit, possibly like Alabama started to this past season. Or we can see teams really figure out what they need in playmaking talent, be able to foster and grow that, and get what they need, bounce back, and make a run for that title. And I think all eyes are especially, needless to say, going to be on LSU because they are the reigning champions. And just like Clemson from last year to this year, people are expecting them to take a little bit of a step back. So if LSU really wants to prove that their championship wasn't just a one-off, or prove that all of their good fortune didn't just come from their Ohio native quarterback, they're going to have a lot to prove. And the SEC, needless to say, is going to be the most fun conference to watch. It usually is the most watched conference anyway, but this year is going to be something special because this year could be a turning point for not just any of the teams in the conference, but for how the conference is looked at altogether as a whole. Now it's time for another break, but when we get back, we're going to take a look at where some of these top players that we've mentioned from the Combine are projected to land in this April's draft. Don't go anywhere.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
We're back, and we've recapped most of the important information from this weekend's Combine. And now that we've taken a look at the stats and we've pointed out a few of the players that should be paid attention to, how about we took a little look ahead at next month's highly anticipated NFL draft. So the undisputed, so far, projected number one pick is, of course, again, LSU's quarterback, Joe Burrow, who is expected to be picked by the Bengals, which makes perfect sense if you follow both Joe Burrow's quarterback skills and the Bengals. Seems like a very logical fit. He's also from the state of Ohio, so it'd be like a hometown boy coming home to play for his state, which of course everyone loves that storyline. But it's not all sunshines and rainbows, because there have been rumors that either the Bengals are going to try to do some last minute draft day possibly, or a blockbuster trade to try to move the pick if they think that he's likely to turn them down, which has been another rumor that people have been telling Joe Burrow to refuse to play for the Bengals if they were to draft him. which he's come out to say that he himself doesn't have any problem with. He's anticipating to be picked by the Bengals, and he's anticipating to play for the Bengals. He's not trying to pull off the Eli Manning, Phillip Rivers quarterback trade on draft day. But you never know leading into the draft what NFL teams are actually thinking, or the direction that they want to go through, or the direction that they want to go to. So anything can happen. And if anything was going to happen, it of course would surround what's been described as the number one talent in this draft, which is Burrow in quarterbacks. And knowing football, both college and NFL, the quarterback is usually viewed as the most important position on the field. So that's what usually gets taken care of first, especially when it comes to drafts. But in this case, the rumors swirling around Joe Burrow don't only involve him. They're also tied to another player, who's pass rusher Chase Young out of Ohio State, who's projected to go number 2 right now to Washington. But because of all the confusion with the picks at the top of the draft, Washington could also be looking to take a quarterback, which is where the rumors from Joe Burrow's pick come in, because there's a possibility that Washington and Cincinnati could organize a way for Washington to get their quarterback, because there's always the opportunity that something could go down last minute, depending on what the NFL teams are looking for. At first, it seemed like Washington drafted their quarterback last year when they took Dwayne Haskins, also out of Ohio State. But now there are rumors that they're looking to draft another quarterback, or that maybe Cincinnati isn't necessarily looking for their quarterback in the draft. But now there are rumors that they could be looking elsewhere besides defense in the draft. There have been rumors about where Cincinnati is looking in the draft. So anything could go down between now and draft day that might see Joe Burrow go number 1 overall, like we're projecting, or might see him go number 2. Or might see Chase Young fall a little further down the top 5 or in the top 10 if teams are looking to fill their holes on offense first. If anything did happen, Young could end up sliding to Detroit at number 3 or to the New York Giants at number 4. And in that case, that would probably mean that Alabama's quarterback, Tua Tagovailoa, of course, coming up again, might make a surprise jump in the rankings. Because before his injury, before he went down, he was projected to be number 1 overall. And depending on how teams are feeling about his injury recovery and about his progress and about whether or not it looks like he'll have the ability to retain his whole skill set and not lose any part of his game in the rehabbing process. If all of those things hold up, he might be the most popular player on this entire draft board. But because of the injury, there's no telling where he might end up. Likely it'll be to the Miami Dolphins at 5. Of course, again, depending on what Washington decides to do with their quarterback situation, if any of those rumors hold up. But it's unlikely that he'd pass Miami because they are also desperately looking for a quarterback. And if they let him slide to number 6, the Chargers are sitting right behind him and also looking to pick up their own quarterback. So looking at this draft, there's a lot of potential for draft day trades. There's a lot of potential for the combine stats to play a big part into where teams and scouts place their confidence. And I think that makes for one of the least predictable upcoming drafts that we've had in a couple years, where you don't know what's going to happen, but you can almost certainly see that players could end up really anywhere, especially with the depth of talent that we have going into this year's draft. Now, we've already talked about Clemson's Isaiah Simmons earlier. He's definitely set himself apart as the clear linebacker to beat, but Ohio State's Jeff Okudah and Florida's CJ Henderson in the secondary have solidified themselves as this year's top-tier cornerbacks. So any of the above players could go to any of the teams in the top 10 that really need to double down on defense and are really struggling, especially teams that have multiple holes to fill on defense. Because like we mentioned before, Isaiah Simmons is a player that can be a plug-and-play, versatile, flexible option that you can honestly put anywhere on the field that you really need him. So teams like the New York Giants or the Detroit Lions or the Carolina Panthers, the LA Chargers, the Jacksonville Jaguars are all teams that you could really see any of those 3 players going to. Simmons most likely will be the first one picked out of that group just because his declared position of linebacker is so essential and is such in demand around the league. But the fact that a team could decide to plug him in at safety or plug him in at cornerback and also get the same level of talent that they would get if they put him at linebacker is a huge asset, which, like was said earlier, is the benefit that comes out of the combine. But besides the holes that need to be filled on defense, which a lot of teams, especially in the top 10, are going to be looking to do, there is also a lot of wide receiver depth this year, like a lot. And there are a lot of standout wide receivers, especially that if it was any other year in a draft that more offensive talent was needed by teams specifically, we would probably see a whole line of wide receivers and explosive playmakers go in the top 10. But there's still going to be plenty to go around in the first round itself, including Bama's Jerry Jeudy, who could possibly go as high as maybe 12 to the New York Jets, because they might need to replace their wide receiver Robbie Anderson, who they haven't signed yet. And just in general, the Jets have been missing a lot of offensive talent, and looking at an offense like Alabama's, they definitely could use a lot of explosive playmaking. And Jerry Jeudy is definitely classified as a top 5 wide receiver in this year's draft. And the only other wide receiver that could possibly go toe-to-toe with him as far as draft stock goes is maybe Oklahoma's CeeDee Lamb, who looks like might end up with the Las Vegas Raiders, who also desperately need a wide receiver. And we can't forget about Jerry Jeudy's teammate that we mentioned earlier, Henry Ruggs III, who, just like Jeudy, probably going to fall to a team that desperately needs a wide receiver like the Philadelphia Eagles at pick 21. So there are a lot of possible options for the first round of the draft, even for the top 10 alone. It's hard to exactly predict where any player is going to go. And that's not necessarily because of the player's talent, especially in this 2020 draft, there is a real depth of talent. And there's also a kind of transition in the way that football is looked at and the way that football is played. So that's going to play a lot into what teams are looking for going forward. And with a lot of new coaching staffs especially, it's going to play a difference into how these players are drafted and how their professional career turns out. Now it's time for another break, but you'll want to hear what's coming up because all those programs that we talked about that needed to be rebuilt, we're going to find out which ones did the best recruiting work to fill those holes when we get back.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
So we're back and we're talking recruitment. We already discussed the programs that are going to feel the most hurt when the draft comes around, like LSU, Georgia, and Alabama. But now we're going to find out which teams are already working on that and have looked ahead a little bit. So a lot of the teams that were mentioned before, the ones that are going to be hit the hardest, are, of course, the teams that are out ahead first of recruiting. And specifically, Georgia has the number 1 recruiting class in the country this year with the most 4-star recruits, which I mentioned earlier. And Clemson is following close behind with 3 of the top 10 prospects themselves and the number 1 overall player in defensive tackle Brian Bresee, who's expected to make a regular impact, which is kind of what we talked about before with players who are expected to kind of step into roles that are being left by players leaving for the draft. And they're kind of expected to just be ready to be placed in the lineup whenever they're called on. But Clemson's going to have more to focus on than just the defensive side of the ball, which was already pretty strong last season and should still be strong going into next year. what they should really be focusing on is the offensive side of the ball. And they're luckier than most schools because they do have their returning starting quarterback in Trevor Lawrence coming back for his junior season. They'll probably have to look at recruiting quarterbacks for next year, but for now, they're solid on that. The one area on offense that they really do need to bone up on, and probably should have boned up on last season, is at wideout. Because they're losing a lot of power with wide receiver T. Higgins entering the draft. Since it's such a deep wide receiver class, a lot of colleges are going to be losing their offensive weapons. But T. Higgins is especially important and potent on Clemson's offense because he's the bulk of Clemson's production on offense and a bulk of their firepower. And he's been compared to players like Randy Moss, and he's been seen to Moss players in highlight reels all throughout his college career. He thrived with Trevor Lawrence at Clemson because he had such a chemistry with Trevor Lawrence, and they thrived together at Clemson. So both of them are going to be missing their opposite link, and Trevor Lawrence is going to have to find a new favorite receiver to throw to for a lot of next season. Or the next school that has really focused on their recruiting class, and it should be no surprise, it's Alabama. Alabama's always hit hard by the NFL draft because obviously as a school in the spotlight, you're going to have the stars that get the most TV time. You're going to have the most expectations coming from your program with a recruiter like Nick Saban spearheading your player development. And they always manage, no matter how many players they lose, they always manage to bounce back, recruit the most top-level players, or at least the best top-level players that fit into Saban's system, and step back onto the field the next season like they never missed a beat. But this year is a little bit of a different story because this is a kind of a turning point in their dynasty. They've started to slip a little bit, and in order to regain the notoriety that they've grown accustomed to, they're going to have to go above and beyond their normal recruiting habits and go above and beyond their plans for their recruits. So looking at who they still have on the roster, they're going to be looking to Mac Jones as the quarterback frontrunner to replace Tua Tagovailoa. But let's not forget that they do have the number 2 overall prospects in Bryce Young as their up-and-coming quarterback recruit. And it's not always likely in college sports since, like was mentioned, redshirting is really popular and a lot of natural freshmen sit out their first year. But Bryce Young is an excellent dual threat quarterback. And out of the current recruiting class, he's probably the quarterback that looks like the most ready to take the field right now, even though he is so young. Like Tua, that came before him, and like other quarterbacks that are a little smaller in stature and get criticized a lot for being so. He's not necessarily the tallest quarterback, only coming in measured between 5'11" and 6 foot most of the time, coming in around 183 pounds. But that's exactly what gives him the type of maneuverability that makes him a dual threat quarterback. And with the transition of the game today, it's a lot more likely that we'll see more quarterbacks kind of taking on that strategy and taking on that style of play. Kind of like how Kyler Murray was a couple of years ago out of Oklahoma. And if it wasn't enough that his abilities on the field are already starter level caliber, he's also been seen to have the football IQ to make the correct calls during plays when needed, read the defense and step away from pressure when need be. And, obviously that's where his legs come in on top of his talent. But his competition and Mac Jones and Tua Tagovailoa, who's Tua's younger brother, are going to get a chance before him. And even though he has a couple of quarterbacks stacked in front of him who are going to get the first shot at that starting role, there's still a pretty good chance that we might see Bryce Young starting under center for Alabama come this fall. Now, another team that really paid extra attention to their recruiting class is Ohio State, who a lot of times gets a little shifted to the side in favor of the spotlight focusing on the SEC teams. But the Big Ten is also a really difficult division to compete in, that's for sure. And a lot of the times you have a lot of great teams, probably more great teams than other conferences have, all competing for the same college football playoff spot or for the same Big Ten title. And Ohio State is usually in the front runner for that. Last season, they definitely were, even though nobody really expected them to take the top Big Ten spot with Urban Meyer leaving and having a new coach and having a quarterback who was still young in Justin Fields. And maybe nobody really expected that their chemistry would come together as quickly as it did and that they'd be able to produce on the field as well as they did and go as far as they did to the college football semifinal game. And you could probably say that they were on the wrong side of a couple calls in that game and it just didn't go their way in some ways, or that they were just outplayed or outmaneuvered by a more experienced playoff team in Clemson. But they still managed to outperform any expectation that they had last year. Coming up for this year, though, they're going to be expected to follow up on it. And they definitely did their homework when it came to recruiting high school players, because they have the 5th best recruiting class this year in the country, and they have the best Big Ten recruiting class overall. Now, Ohio State may not have as many starters to replace, but they desperately needed to make moves that shown that they should be taken seriously and improving their depth on both sides of the ball with their recruiting class, and still coming out ranked so highly even though they had such a great season and knew that they wouldn't necessarily, and knew that they had a couple years with the unit that they had now. They're still preparing to be a power squad going forward. While OSU was mentioned earlier as being the team that was probably hit the hardest by the draft, they also had a chance to recruit the 4th best incoming class. You know, we've already talked about how many essential players they have that are leaving. And with the class that they recruited, the 4th best class, Coach O is trying to become the next Saban-like coach who really can not just establish a dynasty and not only having the entire eyes of the college football world on your program, but also figuring out how to keep him there when you have so many players and coaches that are leaving for bigger things because of how well they performed with your program. So while Ohio State could potentially be built to go all the way this year, LSU, as defending champions, are going to be the first people who have something to say about it. Now it's time for another break, but when we get back, we'll take a little look ahead and we'll see what next season has in store.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Now, there are so many exciting things to discuss when you're talking about a fresh college football season. But one of the things that sticks out the most and probably has the most impact, whether fans know it or not, is rule changes. And last season, there were tons of rule changes that regarded safety and generally tried to keep players more safe and tried to take a little bit of the risk out of football. Even though it's football, so we all know that you can't really do that. But typically there are rule changes in every offseason, and last year was really focused on player safety. Now this year, they seem to be focusing more on targeting the common sense rules. So that's more of things that have to do with the flow of the game and just focusing on a lot of the factors that affect the way fans watch the game. Probably one of the ones that sticks out the most, and one of the ones that fans might be talking about the most, is their idea to cap play reviews to just 2 minutes. And over the last couple seasons, we've seen play reviews make such a huge impact on the game. And those are rules that have been changed recently too, just to try to accommodate referee calls and make sure that they're gotten right. But in trying to make sure that the rules are followed correctly and that all the right calls are made, we're also sacrificing game flow and how into the game that you can get. College football isn't the only sport that it's happening in. But in watching games last season, we did see a lot of start and stop. We did see a lot of players losing their flow. We saw a little bit of disinterest from fans who, get restless in the stands, who get restless watching at home. And it takes a lot of the interest out of watching when you feel like the game isn't moving along. And that's been a big subject of complaints since the review rules had been adjusted. But to see that they're actually listening to the opinions of fans and people who are watching is encouraging to see, even though it's not the only league that we see replay rules being adjusted and changed. But football is unique in the way that it's played, and it has been affecting the game, especially at the college level, which can be so explosive. It kind of hinders that in a way. So for them to put a time limit on the replay rule is a pretty big deal. And the feedback on that rule so far has been pretty positive. Now, another area of contention that has come up has to do with the targeting rule, which was expanded last year. Now, to kind of counteract the changes that they made to the rule a year ago, when players are ejected for targeting, they now have the option to stay on the sidelines instead of being forced to go into the locker room for the rest of the game. This is another one of those rules that plays directly into the style of the game, because a lot of fans express how unhappy they are seeing certain punishments be overextended for certain penalties, because not all targeting penalty is created equal. Sometimes targeting is called just because of the structure of the rule, not necessarily the effects the player had on the field. So for the calls that are a little borderline, or people watching would say is tame, the player doesn't feel like they're receiving the harshest punishment for the foul they actually committed. We haven't actually seen it in action yet, so we don't know what exactly the difference it'll make. But it still gives the feeling that the game is more fair while focusing on player safety. And while they're still focusing a little bit on player safety, the next rule that they wanted to impose was about increasing the referee jurisdiction time from 60 minutes to 90 minutes so that they get 30 minutes of extra time before the game to help curtail any pregame trash talking, which sometimes then turns into fights. And we saw last season a couple of pregame skirmishes and pregame fighting issues, especially between teams that have a lot of beef and a lot of rivalry between each other. And the idea is that with the referees out on the field and in control for 30 minutes before the game, it can help prevent players from wanting to get into any extra activities before the game or from carrying that energy into the game, which we've seen happen and ends up delaying the game more because you have to stop and break players up, break up fights, and throw players out of the game. And all of these things ultimately speak to the flow of the game. But the only rules that were discussed by the committee weren't only ones that are going to affect the game on the field. They also discussed a couple rules that are just for the players. And it's nice to see that the NCAA is actually listening to its players for a change and following through on some of the things that they requested, such as adding the number 0 as a legal jersey number for the first time because they've noticed how popular single jersey numbers have gotten. At the same time, it's probably a good thing that they're trying to expand the numbers that are worn on jerseys, because they also recommended that no more than 2 players on the same team wear the same number. As it stands, players on the same team can wear the same number, but the exception is that they have to play different positions and can't be on the field at the same time. But with the decisions being made soon, it'll be really interesting to see which player from which school around the country becomes the first college player to wear the number 0. And it's interesting to take a look at how all of these rules affect each game and what the potential is for how they can affect them differently. Because the point is to get a seamless, enjoyable result out of games. And a lot of and some college football fans would say that a lot of the changes that have come over the last few years have kind of taken a little bit of the authenticity out of college football. And it'll be interesting to see what the new opinion will be on these new rule changes once we start to see how the game changes a little bit. And it seems like the NCAA and other leagues really aren't shying away from rule changes that are meant to improve the game. But at the same time, it still remains to be seen whether or not all of these changes will come into effect or whether or not we'll see some of them, because the NCAA oversight panel won't vote on the changes until April 16th. So we'll have some time to kind of digest the news as we get it and kind of prepare ourselves for what college football looks like going forward, or whether or not it'll change at all. Now it's time for one last pause, but on the other side of the break, we're going to take a look back into the Combine's past and see which stars that we know and love today shined early and had fun doing it back then.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
We're back, and we've already talked about the upcoming NFL draft, but for this last segment, we're going to take a step back in time. We're going to take a look at a time when today's NFL legends hadn't built their legacies yet, and we're just in the same place that the Combine participants were in today, just trying to make an impression on a professional league that they're trying to break into. Sometimes performers at the Combine turn out to be exactly what we expect. And even though it's not a surprise, it's still sure as fun as hell to watch. And one example of that, it definitely has to be Calvin Johnson's Combine performance from 2007, which almost didn't even happen because he decided to participate at the last minute. And it shouldn't shock anyone that he finished the 40-yard dash in 4.35 seconds. And he was carrying 239 pounds at the time. So we all know the stereotype of thicker wide receivers is that they don't have the speed to counteract their size, but Calvin Johnson, Megatron, back in 2007 definitely proved that. And he didn't even use his own shoes, which just makes the story even crazier. Now, you don't always have to look to the Combine to determine who's going to end up making it in the NFL. A lot of times, there could be a good Combine performance that a lot of players don't live up to as professionals, or some professionals didn't do well at the Combine or didn't show up at all and still managed to blow everybody away, and it had no effect on their professional career. It's not always an indication of who's going to excel. It's not written in stone. But there are a lot of players that it's fun to take a look back on and see where they started. So one of those players is Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie. It's important to point out players like that and how important the Combine is to players like Rodgers-Cromartie, because he came out of a subdivision school, an FCS school, instead of a Division I Power 5 conference, where players are seen on TV nationally every week. So if you're coming from a school like Tennessee State, like DRC, you're not going to have a chance, as much of a chance anyway, to make an impact on scouts the way you would have if you had highlight reels that were being played on national TV every week. So recognizing that opportunity, DRC came out in 2008 and lit up every event and didn't disappoint in Indianapolis, running the 40-yard dash in 4.29 seconds, having a broad jump leap of 10 feet, almost 11 feet, and recording a 38.5-inch vertical jump. And he distanced himself from the rest of his peers and the rest of his group. And the rest is history. But he's not the only one who came and showed out the Combine in his day. Because Bo Jackson at the 1986 Combine debatably had one of the best performances ever. And even though no official records were kept for the 40-yard dash times, he has what could probably be called the best 40 time ever at 4.12 seconds. Which is unheard of nowadays, and we don't know when we'll see anybody come that close again. But even debatably, Bo Jackson doesn't have the best Combine performance, because just 3 years later, because Deion Primetime Sanders, coming out of Florida State University, didn't even participate in the entirety of the 1989 Combine. Because he was a star at Florida State, and you knew his name. You could make the argument that that Combine is what gave him his notoriety in the first place, because he got his legendary nickname, Primetime, from the one event he actually showed up to participate in. So the story goes that Deion walked in late. He only ran in one event, the 40-yard dash. He only did it one time. He bolted across the finish line, still in stride, kept going, ran to a limousine, and left. He didn't even need to do anything else. His time was 4.29, which was ridiculous given the fact that he was, 1, a defensive player, and 2, his size. But as we know today, it was everything that we needed to know about Primetime. And it did wonders for his draft stock because he was picked 5th overall in that year's 1989 draft. So we've seen that the Combine can be kind of complex. It's beneficial for students that are coming from FCS or subdivision schools to finally get a platform to put their talent out there. We've seen that it can make no difference for players who are maybe in a Power 5 conference and their talent is already widely known and they're already highly anticipated in the draft. Or it could take what we don't even recognize as a budding star and then give them the stage to shine. Really, it's the catapult to a football player's professional career, whether they participate in it or not. An individual's choices surrounding the combine is their first chance to give the NFL scouts a chance to know who they are, and it's the last chance for us as college football fans to really see the authentic passion that we fell in love with in those players in the first place before they go on to take the next step in their careers. But at the same time, the beauty of the combine process shows that there's always going to be new players who are just as passionate and are willing to show what they got. So thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.